The barren landscape of Zereth 7 stretched out in every direction, an endless sea of golden dunes and jagged rock formations, all beneath a sky the color of blood. Finn Carter stood at the top of a small dune, his scavenger gear covered in fine dust from the relentless winds. His once shiny helmet visor was scratched, reflecting the harsh glare of Zereth 7's twin suns. He squinted into the distance, hoping to catch sight of something valuable, anything that might make this trip worthwhile. Nothing. Not a trace of movement. Just sand and the distant outline of a massive, rusted wreck. Finn sighed, feeling the weight of his nearly empty pack and the nagging thirst that had settled in the back of his throat. His water supply was down to a single canteen, and if he didn't find shelter or a way off this planet soon, his scavenging days would be over. Zereth 7 had once been a bustling mining colony, but after the Great War between the Galactic Alliance and the Korath Empire, it was abandoned. The planet was littered with wreckage, broken ships, collapsed structures, and remnants of alien technology, most of it long scavenged by others like him. He pulled a small device from his pocket and scanned the horizon again, hoping to pick up any signs of power or salvageable tech. The device beeped faintly as it detected a distant energy signature, but it was too weak to be useful. Still, it was better than nothing. Great, he muttered to himself as he trudged forward. Let's hope it's not another dead end. The sand crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the wreckage in the distance. He had seen countless abandoned ships on dozens of planets, but there was always the chance something valuable had been left behind: spare parts, scrap metal, or, if he was really lucky, working components that could be sold to the right buyer. Survival in the outer colonies was tough, and Finn had long since learned that he could trust no one but himself. The sun beat down mercilessly, its heat sapping his strength with every step. Finn wiped the sweat from his brow and took a small sip from his canteen, careful not to waste a single drop. The heat was unbearable, but what worried him more was the loneliness of this planet. There had been no signs of life since he arrived, not even a trace of wildlife. Hours passed before he reached the wreckage. Up close, the ship looked ancient, its hull partially buried in the sand. The once sleek exterior of alien design had been corroded by years of exposure to the elements. Finn cautiously approached, stepping over debris and shattered panels. His mind raced with the possibilities of what he might find inside. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his hip. Something or someone was nearby. He crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of danger. And then he saw her. At first, it looked like a pile of tattered fabric, barely visible against the backdrop of sand and wreckage. But as Finn moved closer, he realized it was a person, small, frail, and huddled in the shadow of a broken wing. He took a few cautious steps forward, his heart racing. The figure was a girl, no older than her late teens by human standards, but it was clear she wasn't human. Her skin was a pale silver, shimmering faintly in the sunlight, and her large, violet eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. Her clothes, thin, flowing fabric, were tattered and covered in dust. She was clearly alien, her features unfamiliar yet strangely delicate. Beside her, nestled in the folds of her clothes, were three small creatures. They looked like they had once been full of life, with smooth blue skin and delicate limbs, but now they lay motionless, their tiny bodies twitching weakly. Finn had never seen creatures like these before, but it was clear they were in bad shape. "Hey," he called out softly, kneeling down next to the girl, unsure if she could understand him. "You okay?" Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her lips cracked and dry. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper, too weak to form words. Instead, she gestured weakly toward the small creatures beside her. Finn didn't need to understand her language to know what she was trying to say. The creatures were dying, dehydrated and starving, just like her. He glanced at his canteen, then back at the girl. He had just enough water to make it back to his ship, maybe. But she didn't have that luxury. If he walked away now, she and her pets wouldn't survive the night. "What are you doing out here?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to her. This planet was a graveyard, not a place for someone like her to survive. It didn't make sense. He studied the girl more closely. There was something different about her, something that told him she wasn't just some stranded alien. Her skin seemed to glow faintly, as if she was more than she appeared, being tied to something far greater than he could comprehend. And the way she held those creatures. It was as though their lives were tied to hers. Finn's instincts screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. He had to look out for himself, he always had. But something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Compassion, maybe. Or guilt. Either way, he couldn't leave her here to die. Not when he had the power to save her. Reluctantly, he unscrewed the cap of his canteen and held it out to her. "Here," he said. "Drink." The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she accepted the canteen with trembling hands. She took a small sip, her throat too parched to handle more, then passed the canteen to her creatures. One by one, the small blue beings took tiny, desperate sips of water, their dull eyes flickering with the faintest hint of life. Finn watched in silence, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as the girl's pets slowly regained their strength. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he had given up his last water. It was reckless. But as he watched the girl's face soften with relief, he realized it wasn't about survival. It was about doing something that mattered. For the first time in years, Finn Carter had chosen to care. The girl looked up at him with those violet eyes, filled with gratitude and something else, hope. She tried to speak again, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Finn nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't know what was happening, but he had a feeling this was only the beginning. The desert winds howled outside the wreckage, and as night began to fall, Finn knew they had to find a way out of this wasteland together. The night on Zareth 7 was as unforgiving as the day, with the temperature plummeting as soon as the twin suns dipped below the horizon. The air turned bitterly cold, and the winds became fierce, howling through the cracks in the wreckage like ghostly whispers from the past. Finn and Nira, the alien girl, took shelter inside the hull of the downed ship, the rusted metal walls barely holding up against the force of the storm outside. Finn shivered, rubbing his arms for warmth, but his mind was far from the cold. It was consumed by the single most pressing concern, water. His canteen was empty now. The last few precious drops had been given to Nira and her three strange, fragile pets, Kuro, Zia, and Rilo. The small creatures were huddled close to their mistress, their eyes no longer as lifeless as they had been earlier. They were still weak, but alive, thanks to Finn's sacrifice. He sat in silence, leaning back against the cold, metal wall, staring out through a jagged tear in the hull at the dark desert beyond. The wind whipped through the opening, carrying with it the scent of dry dust and decay. His mind wandered, replaying the moment he handed over his last water, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But doubt crept in. He had barely enough water for himself before, and now he had none. There was no guarantee he'd find more, and the ship's filtration systems had long since been stripped. He could feel the dryness in his mouth, the roughness in his throat. It wouldn't be long before dehydration set in for him, too. Nira sat across from him, her silver skin dimly reflecting the pale light of Zareth 7's moons as they rose into the night sky. Her eyes were half closed, her exhaustion evident. Her pets, though still recovering, nuzzled against her gently, their bodies warm and content. She hadn't said much since Finn had given them water, just the occasional glance of gratitude, but now she broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, the strange lilt of her alien language still audible through the universal translator Finn wore in his ear. Finn shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I couldn't just let them die. You either." Nira looked down at her pets, her fingers running through the soft, azure fur of Kuro, the smallest of the trio. "They mean everything to me," she whispered. Without them, I would have no reason left to survive. Finn frowned, confused. What do you mean? Why are you even here? This place is a death trap. No one survives on Zareth 7. Nira closed her eyes, as if the weight of her memories was too much to bear. I didn't mean to come here. My people. The Ilari. We once traveled the stars, nomads by nature, but our home was taken from us in the war. After that, we scattered. I was on a ship, trying to find refuge with the others of my kind, but we were attacked by scavengers. Pirates. My ship was destroyed, and I crash-landed here. She paused, her voice growing faint. I thought I could survive with what little I had left, but the storms came. And my water ran out. Her violet eyes met Finn's, and he could see the pain there, the loneliness that mirrored his own. I tried to keep Kuro, Zia, and Rilo alive. They are the only companions I have left. Ilari bond with animals from our world. It's a connection deeper than anything. Without them, I am lost. Finn nodded, understanding now the desperation in her eyes when he had first found her. It wasn't just about survival for her, it was about preserving the last ties she had to her people, to her past. He glanced at the small creatures again. They were still weak, but they clung to life, just like Nira. But what about him? What about his survival? He had barely enough strength to continue this scavenger's life as it was, and now he was in an even worse position. No water, no backup plan, and a dwindling supply of energy. The decision he had made was noble, sure, but was it smart? Could he really justify giving up his own chance to live? Nira seemed to sense his turmoil. You saved them. I don't know how to thank you. Finn shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. Gratitude felt hollow when the weight of his decision was sinking in. He knew he couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to reach his ship, which was still a few miles away. But the distance seemed insurmountable without water. There's nothing to thank me for yet, he muttered. We still have a long way to go. My ship's busted, but the shelter there is better than this. And maybe we can figure out how to get off this rock. Nira nodded, though the exhaustion in her eyes made it clear that even the thought of walking was overwhelming. She wasn't fully recovered, and neither were her pets. And Finn wasn't sure he had the strength to carry them all if they collapsed. As the silence stretched between them, Finn's thoughts began to spiral. He was a survivor. That's what he did. He took care of himself, got in and out of situations that most people wouldn't even attempt. But this was different. He wasn't alone anymore. And being responsible for someone else, even someone like Nira, who wasn't even human, was terrifying in a way he hadn't expected. I don't know how we're going to make it, he finally admitted, his voice low, more to himself than to her. Nira's eyes were soft when she looked at him. We will, she said with quiet certainty. I know we will. Finn wanted to believe her. He really did. But all he could think about was the oppressive thirst growing inside him, and the knowledge that every step they took would bring them closer to the point where his body would give out. There were no guarantees on this planet. And hope was a fragile thing. As the cold wind howled outside their makeshift shelter, Finn closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the metal wall. He would rest for now, just a little, and then they'd move. They had to. He wasn't sure when he had drifted off, but when he woke, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The wind had died down, leaving the desert eerily still. He glanced over at Nira, who was still asleep, her pets curled protectively around her. For a moment, they looked so peaceful, as if they were anywhere but this deadly, abandoned planet. Finn stood slowly, his legs stiff from the cold. He needed to move. Staying here would only delay the inevitable. As he prepared to wake Nira, he caught sight of his reflection in the cracked visor of his helmet. His face was gaunt, the toll of dehydration clear in the sunken lines beneath his eyes. He didn't have much time left, and they both knew it. But then, something unexpected happened. Nira stirred, waking as though she had sensed Finn's distress. She looked at him, and without a word, she reached into a small pouch at her waist. From it, she pulled a tiny, crystal-like device, no larger than a pebble. She held it in her palm, her violet eyes glowing with a strange, ancient wisdom. "This," she said softly, "is Ilari technology. It's old, and it's not meant for emergencies like this. But it might buy us some time." Finn frowned. "What is it?" Nira hesitated, then placed the crystal in his hand. It hummed softly, a faint warmth emanating from it. "It's a nanocore. It can replenish energy and slow down the effects of dehydration temporarily. It won't give us water, but it will keep your body from shutting down long enough to find it." Finn looked at the small device in awe. "You've had this the whole time?" "It's not a permanent solution," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "I had to save it for when I thought it was truly needed. And I wasn't sure if it would work on you." Without waiting for further explanation, Finn pressed the device to his forearm, and instantly, he felt a surge of warmth flood through his veins. His body reacted immediately, his muscles loosening, his mind clearing. It wasn't water, but it was something. It was hope. "I didn't think you'd be willing to share your last resource with me," Finn said quietly. Nira met his gaze, her expression serious but kind. "You shared your last water with me, Finn Carter. Now, I will share my last hope with you." And for the first time since they had met, Finn smiled because maybe, just maybe, they had a chance after all. The sun rose slowly over Zereth 7, painting the dunes with hues of gold and crimson. The planet was a paradox of extreme freezing nights, scorching days, and Finn felt the oppressive heat seeping back into the air as he and Nira prepared for the long trek to his ship. Their temporary shelter had shielded them from the worst of the cold, but now the desert's unforgiving heat would test their endurance once more. The Ilari crystal had given Finn a temporary boost, but he could still feel the weight of dehydration pressing against his body. The warmth it provided was fading, and though it had bought them some time, it was no replacement for actual water. He cast a glance at Nira, who was gathering her pets into the folds of her tattered robes. Kuro, Zia, and Rilo seemed livelier now, their eyes bright and alert, but the exhaustion still lingered in the depths of their movements. "We need to move quickly," Finn said, strapping on his scavenger gear and adjusting the rusted blaster at his side. "The ship's about 5 miles north from here, but the heat will get worse once we're out in the open." Nira nodded, her violet eyes narrowing in determination. Despite her fragile appearance, Finn had come to realize that there was a quiet strength in her. She was driven by more than just survival. She carried the weight of her past, the bond with her pets, and the legacy of her people. Finn didn't know if he could fully understand that kind of connection, but he respected it. "I will keep pace," she said firmly, though her voice was soft. "I won't slow you down." Finn knew better than to argue. There was no room for hesitation on Zereth 7, and though he wasn't sure she could keep up, he appreciated her resolve. They had to push forward, and every second they delayed put them closer to death. The two of them set off into the wasteland, their boots sinking into the loose sand with every step. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, a maze of shifting dunes and jagged rock formations that distorted the horizon. The air shimmered with heat, creating mirages in the distance that flickered like phantom images of water. As they walked, Finn couldn't help but feel the growing tension in the pit of his stomach. He knew Zereth 7 was more than just a barren world, it was a graveyard. Countless scavengers and explorers had come here over the years, most of them never to be seen again. The desert had a way of swallowing people whole, and Finn didn't want to become just another forgotten soul lost to the sands. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the wind's occasional howl. Finn's thoughts wandered, replaying the events of the past few days. He'd come to Zereth 7 for salvage, looking for a way to make a quick profit, but instead, he'd found Nira and her pets a discovery that had completely upended his priorities. He had never intended to be anyone's savior, but now it felt as if fate had thrust him into a situation he couldn't walk away from. "You said your ship is close," Nira said after a long stretch of silence, her voice hoarse from the dry air. "What's the plan once we reach it?" Finn glanced at her, shielding his eyes from the sun's glare. "It's an old scavenger ship, not much, but it's got emergency supplies. We can ride out the next storm inside and try to get the communication systems back online. I can send out a distress signal, maybe catch the attention of a passing freighter." Nira nodded thoughtfully, though Finn could tell she was still holding back something. He'd noticed the way she carried herself, cautious, guarded, as though there was more to her story than she had revealed. But he didn't push her. There was no point in stirring up secrets out here, not when survival was their only goal. As they trudged on, the relentless sun climbed higher, burning the back of Finn's neck and leaving his throat dry and parched. He reached for his canteen out of habit, but stopped when he remembered it was empty. The thought gnawed at him, a reminder of the gamble he had taken by giving his last water to Nira and her pets. There was no room for regret now, though. They had to focus on getting to the ship. They reached the halfway point when Nira suddenly stumbled, her foot catching in the loose sand. She fell to her knees, and the creatures nestled in her arms let out soft, worried cries. Finn was by her side in an instant, kneeling beside her and helping her up. "You okay?" he asked, concern etching his features. Nira nodded, though her breathing was labored. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just tired." Finn's eyes narrowed. He could see the exhaustion in her movements, the way she held herself as if every step was an effort. He knew the signs dehydration was beginning to take its toll on her, just as it was on him. They didn't have much time left. But before he could say anything more, the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, a faint vibration that ran through the sand. But then, it grew stronger, and the ground shook with such force that Finn had to brace himself to keep from falling. He looked around wildly, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What the hell, Dash?" Finn muttered, his hand instinctively going to his blaster. Nira's eyes widened in fear. "The desert shifts," she said, her voice urgent. "Something is coming." Before Finn could ask what she meant, a massive shadow loomed on the horizon, rising from behind the dunes like a dark wave. It was a sandstorm larger than any Finn had ever seen, its swirling winds already whipping sand into the air. The storm roared as it surged forward, consuming everything in its path. "We need to find shelter," Finn shouted, grabbing Nira's arm and pulling her to her feet. "Now!" But there was nowhere to run. The desert was vast and open, with no cover in sight. The storm was moving too quickly. Within minutes, it would be upon them. "Stay close to me," Finn shouted over the howling winds as the storm descended upon them. He wrapped his arm around Nira and her pets, shielding them as best he could with his body. The wind hit like a wall, sand blasting against his skin with enough force to sting. It felt like being trapped in a hurricane of dust and grit. The world around them disappeared in the chaos of the storm. Visibility dropped to zero, and Finn could barely make out Nira's outline beside him. The roar of the wind was deafening, and the sand swirled in every direction, threatening to bury them alive. Finn gritted his teeth and forced himself to move forward, his hand gripping Nira's tightly as they fought against the gale. His legs burned from the effort, and every breath he took was filled with sand. They couldn't survive long like this. He knew that. "We need to find cover," Finn shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. Nira's voice reached him, faint but determined. "They're up ahead." Through the blinding sand, Finn squinted and saw the faint outline of something, a dark shape rising out of the desert. It was a small outcrop of rocks, barely visible in the storm's fury, but it was enough. With renewed urgency, Finn dragged Nira toward the rocks, his body aching from the effort. They reached the outcrop just as the storm's full force hit. Finn pushed Nira against the rock wall, using his body to shield her and the pets from the worst of the wind. Sand continued to batter them, but the rocks provided just enough shelter to keep them from being buried alive. For what felt like hours, the storm raged. Finn's limbs grew numb, and his lungs burned from inhaling the dust. His mind swirled with fatigue, and his vision blurred. But he held on, keeping Nira close, refusing to give in to the darkness that threatened to consume him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the storm began to subside. The wind eased, and the air grew still once more. Finn opened his eyes, blinking against the light as the dust began to settle. The desert was quiet again, as if the storm had never happened. But they had survived. Breathing heavily, Finn slowly pulled himself away from the rock, his body aching from head to toe. He looked at Nira, who was still cradling her pets, her silver skin streaked with dust, but her eyes filled with relief. "We made it," Finn said, his voice hoarse. Nira nodded weakly, her face pale from exhaustion. "Thanks to you." Finn forced a weary smile. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess. But we're close." He glanced over at the horizon, where his ship was still miles away, but now visible again, its dark silhouette standing against the endless dunes. They had survived the storm, but the real challenge was yet to come. With a deep breath, Finn helped Nira to her feet. They had a ship to reach, and survival was still within their grasp. Together, they would make it. The world around them had returned to an eerie stillness after the storm, the howling winds replaced by the oppressive quiet of the desert. Zereth 7's twin suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. Finn and Nira stood side by side, their clothes caked with sand and their bodies worn from the relentless journey. In the distance, Finn's ship, their final hope, was just barely visible, a dark silhouette on the horizon. Finn's body ached with exhaustion. His muscles felt like they had been torn apart by the storm, and the Alari crystal's effects had long since faded. Every step toward the ship was a battle, and each breath burned in his chest from dehydration. The air was dry and scorching again, and without water, their chances of survival were slim. Nira, too, was struggling. Her silver skin, once radiant and ethereal, was dull and covered in fine dust. Her large violet eyes were heavy with fatigue, though she remained focused, clutching her 3 pets Kuro, Zia, and Rilo tightly in her arms. The creatures, though alive, were weak from the ordeal, their tiny bodies trembling with each breath. Finn glanced over at Nira, watching as she pressed forward with sheer determination, her pets cradled protectively against her chest. Despite the overwhelming odds, she hadn't given up. Her strength, fueled by her love for the creatures in her care, was something that both impressed and humbled Finn. He had come to this planet alone, but now he had a reason to keep going, something beyond just his own survival. "We're close," Finn said, his voice rough from thirst. "Just another mile." Nira nodded, though she didn't speak. Her lips were cracked and dry, and every step seemed to cost her more energy than the last. Finn could see that she was nearing her limit. He was too. They moved in silence, the vast desert stretching endlessly before them. The ship loomed closer with each passing moment, but the weight of exhaustion bore down on Finn like a heavy cloak. His vision blurred, and his mind drifted back to moments of regret, wondering if he had made the right choice by giving up his last water. Would they even survive long enough to reach the ship? The thought gnawed at him, the reality of their situation too dire to ignore. But he pushed on. There was no choice. As they approached the ship, Finn felt his knees start to buckle. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. He couldn't collapse now. Not when they were so close. The ship's hull was battered and worn, but it was still intact, a small, rusted scavenger vessel that had once been his lifeline. Now, it was their only hope. "There it is," Finn said, his voice barely audible. "We made it." Nira swayed slightly as she stood beside him, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. She looked at him with gratitude, her lips moving to form words, but no sound came out. She simply nodded, too tired to speak. Finn staggered forward, using the last of his strength to reach the ship's entrance. His hands fumbled with the controls, but after a few agonizing seconds, the door hissed open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The stale air inside felt like a relief compared to the suffocating heat outside. "Get inside," Finn said, motioning for Nira to follow. Nira stepped into the ship, carefully lowering her pets to the floor as they huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling. Finn followed her inside, slamming the door shut behind them and collapsing against the wall. The ship's atmosphere system kicked in, circulating breathable air, though the dryness in Finn's throat remained, a painful reminder of their desperate need for water. Finn sat there for a moment, his head resting against the cold metal wall as he closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he let the silence envelop him. They had made it this far, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The emergency systems were still online, but without power, their chances of getting off the planet were slim. "I need to check the systems," Finn muttered, forcing himself to stand. Nira nodded, sitting beside her pets. Her exhaustion was palpable, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. They were in the ship, and that meant there was still a chance. Finn stumbled to the control panel, his fingers shaking as he keyed in the ship's diagnostics. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of warnings and damage reports. The storm had battered the ship's outer hull, but the interior systems were mostly intact. However, the main power core was still offline. "I can get the power back," Finn said, more to himself than to Nira. "But it'll take time." His eyes scanned the diagnostics, his mind working despite the haze of exhaustion. There was a backup generator, but its energy reserves were nearly depleted. He could reroute power to the life support systems and possibly to the communications array, but it wouldn't be enough to power the engines for a full escape. As Finn worked, Nira's voice broke the silence. "Finn, you've done so much already," she said softly. "But we need more than this, don't we?" He turned to face her, and for the first time, saw the uncertainty in her eyes. She knew the same truth he did: without water, they wouldn't survive long enough for a rescue. Even if he managed to get the communications system online, the signal could take days to reach a passing ship. And without a functioning power core, they were stranded. Nira hesitated for a moment, then slowly rose to her feet. She approached Finn, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into the pouch at her waist, the same pouch that had held the Ilari crystal earlier. This time, she withdrew something different. In her palm lay a small, translucent vial, glowing faintly with a soft, azure light. The liquid inside seemed to shimmer, catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. "This is my last hope," Nira whispered. "It's Ilari life essence. Our people carried this on long journeys across the stars. It can revitalize, heal, and sustain life. But it comes at a cost." Finn stared at the vial, the glow casting a strange, otherworldly light on Nira's face. He didn't fully understand what she was offering, but the look in her eyes told him everything. It was more than just water. It was her people's last relic, a piece of the ancient technology that had sustained them for centuries. "You've been saving this," Finn said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nira nodded. "It was meant to be used in case. In case I had no other choice." Finn shook his head. "You should keep it for yourself. You need it more than I do." But Nira stepped closer, her expression resolute. "You saved my life. You saved Kuro, Zia, and Rilo. If not for you, we wouldn't have made it this far." Her hand trembled as she held out the vial. "This is the only way we survive. Together." Finn hesitated, staring at the vial. He had come to Zareth 7 as a scavenger, a lone wanderer looking out for himself. But now, he wasn't alone. Nira, her pets, they had become his responsibility, and in some strange, unexpected way, they had given him a reason to keep fighting. With a heavy heart, Finn took the vial from Nira's hand. He uncapped it and stared at the shimmering liquid inside. It was small, but he could feel its energy radiating from the vial, something far beyond human technology. "Are you sure?" Finn asked one last time. Nira nodded, her expression filled with quiet determination. "We share the burden." Without another word, Finn drank the liquid. The taste was cool and sweet, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The moment it touched his throat, a wave of warmth spread through his body, filling him with renewed energy. The pain in his muscles eased, and the thirst that had plagued him for days began to fade. Nira's eyes flickered with hope as she watched him, her own weariness starting to fade as she too shared in the essence. Her pets, nestled beside her, let out soft, contented sounds, their small bodies regaining strength. As the warmth spread through them, Finn knew that they had one last chance. They would survive, and together, they would find a way off this forsaken planet. The universe was vast, and filled with dangers beyond imagination. But in that moment, as Finn and Nira stood side by side, they knew one thing for certain. Hope was stronger than any storm.